Thank you, Christina. Hello, my name is Bob Hoster, and I've been with the firm since 2013. My specialization is internal control assessments as well as IT control assessments for our client organizations. The presentation today, we're going to be talking about managing softwares, whether your organization utilizes a cloud service provider or hosts the software internally at your business office, requires a strategic approach that addresses best practices for vendor management. And as part of this process, you can consider this like a four-step process. And I've broken these out into four specific sections: vendor assessment and selection, negotiating a contract and service level agreement with your provider, monitoring vendor performance and compliance, and finally, internal controls. So the first section we want to talk about is vendor assessment and selection. The first step you want to do is obviously determine your organization's software needs. And primarily, your software needs are going to be either transaction processing, accounting, and financial reporting related for the most part. The first thing you probably would want to do is obtain some software vendor referrals from organizations who have similar business operations to your organization. This would give you an initial guide to possible vendors that other organizations are using and have some experience with. Once you compile this initial list of potential vendors, you want to do some due diligence. And one of the first things I always would ask for is obtain a financial statement from the vendor to kind of assess their financial standing. In some cases, some vendors will share that information with you and other ones will not. This is particularly important if you have sort of a vendor who is a small business where there might be only one or two individuals managing the organization, where there might be some risk that the organization may not be able to provide continued support, especially if they only have a few people running the organization. Some other things to think about when you're doing due diligence is the security measures that the vendor has in place to protect your organization's data. This is particularly important for making sure that they have the adequate internal controls over IT security within their organization to protect your data that they're going to be managing. Some vendors will even provide you what they call SOC audit reports. And the most common ones there are the SOC 1 Type 2 reports, which is mostly related to financial reporting. And then there's also what they call a SOC 2 Type 2 report, which is more based on IT security controls. Some of your more sophisticated vendors have these type of audit reports available for their clients that the clients can request them and review them prior to and even during when they engage them as part of a vendor contract. And another part that you want to consider is even just customer reviews of the vendor themselves. Are they providing the vendors? You can then sort of get an assessment of the vendor's track record of their reliability, performance, and providing customer support to their client organizations. One of the key things as part of the due diligence process is, especially for cloud vendors, is you want to assess the potential risks that come with that type of service, such as the risk of security breaches, service outages, as well as compliance violations. This is an important component that you'll need to be thinking about as part of your vendor due diligence. And you'll also want to evaluate how the prospective vendor's software aligns with your specific organization's business needs and technical requirements. It's very important to get a good match between the vendor and your organization to make sure that they're going to be able to provide the service that your organization needs. Next, once you get past the vendor assessment and selection stage, the next step is to negotiate a contract and service level agreement with the vendors that you're looking to hire. First, you want to define the scope of service that you want to include in your vendor contract. This generally includes the type of services you're going to be expecting from the vendor, the deliverables that the vendor is going to be providing to your organization, the timelines for delivery, and as well as the payment terms of the contract. And it's important to negotiate robust service level agreements that would specify certain things such as availability, specific performance metrics such as uptime, response time, and resolution time for issues, and any penalties for possible non-compliance with the provisions of the contract. You'll also want to include in your contract clauses for who owns the data, data security of your data, confidentiality clauses, backup and recovery strategies for your organization's data that the vendor will be responsible for, and as well as possible termination clauses in case you need to get out of the contract. But you also want to address the vendor's responsibility for patching the software, which generally means performing updates of the software itself, whether it's on your own locally hosted systems or on the cloud. And also, you want to identify any possible indemnification and liability in case there might be breaches or other types of damages that your organization needs to seek out once you've entered into the contract. But it's mostly very important to develop a clear exit strategy that outlines how your organization would safely disengage with the vendor if you need to, including any possible data migration and retrieval processes to get your organization's data over to another possible vendor. The next step in the process is to monitor vendor performance and compliance. Monitoring vendor performance can include many things. It includes basically monitoring the vendor's performance against the clauses and performance provisions that are included in your contract. Key performance indicators that you might want to consider for this part is basically delivery time, the quality of service, the vendor's response time to address issues that come up that might be encountered during the duration of your contract term with them, their availability and uptime, how often are they up versus down in processing your information, and as well as compliance with regulations. So those are some of the key performance indicators to consider when you're monitoring your vendor performance against the contract. A lot of times, organizations will also utilize software tools for monitoring service availability, real resource utilization, and monitoring security events. That is particularly important, particularly related to security events. You want to make sure that there's not going to be any types of breaches or holes in this vendor software that might result in a downtime for your organization. You'll also want to conduct regular audits of your vendor data and also engage in discussions with your software vendor to address any possible issues or identify areas for improvement that the vendor could provide to your organization. And it's also particularly important to make sure that the vendor security posture directly aligns with your organization's security requirements. So if you have very strict access security policies, information security policies, you'll generally want to make sure that the vendor's organization is pretty compliant with what your requirements of your organization is, particularly if you're in a highly regulated environment. And finally, it's important to have a contingency plan, which involves developing a comprehensive risk management plan, including any mitigation strategies, incident response procedures to any issues that might come up, backup and disaster recovery plans for key business processes due to an unexpected vendor downtime or any other issues that might be encountered during the period of your contract. And then finally, I wanted to move on and discuss some basic internal controls that you're going to be encountering when you engage with a vendor software. The first one is access security. First one that you need to be considered is user security access. Most vendor software that you has a built-in security module, which allows access to assign access to users based on either their transaction processing responsibilities or accounting responsibilities. And it's important to assign the modules to the people who have the responsibility for performing these functions. And the person that's normally is responsible for assigning that access is called a security administrator. And these softwares, the vendor softwares, come with security administrator accounts. And generally, you want to limit the amount of people that have these administrative rights to only certain authorized personnel. Generally, that falls within person with maybe one or two people within your accounting function. It might be your controller, your CFO, or it might be a person that's in your IT department. Also, another area that you may want to be considering as part of your internal controls is vendor accounts or service accounts. Generally, vendor software comes with these type of default accounts, which generally allows the vendor to come into your software to perform updates to your software, when they have a new version of that software that they want to install. It's important that you monitor this access, and you want to know when the vendor is going to be performing that update. During periods of time when the vendor is not going to be using that account to perform an update, you might want to consider disabling it, just to make sure that nobody else can access those rights to go in and change the software on your system. And finally, you want to conduct periodic reviews of your user access rights. This includes really reviewing the access that has been granted to employees previously to make sure there's been no significant changes in their job role, as well as making sure as all terminated employees have had their access rights removed as part of that termination process. The next thing you want to consider for an internal control is backups, and you can categorize these in two different areas: cloud-based versus locally hosted. If it's cloud-based, generally the vendor is going to be responsible for performing the backups. But in this case, you as an organization want to inquire about the vendor backup procedures of your organization's data to obtain an understanding of what their process is. This is just based from an educational standpoint, particularly if the vendor spells out in the contract that they are going to be responsible for performing a backup and restoring your organization's data in cases of downtime. Now, if you host the vendor software locally, your organization will be responsible for the backup of the software. And it's very critical that your organization performs backup restore data testing of your data from your backup resources to ensure that you can restore the information from the point that you might have had a breach or gone down, your systems might have gone down to the point where they just reestablish processing from the point in time that is current. And finally, the last thing to consider is change management of vendor software. Vendors are always going to have software updates to their software, most commonly. So you want to monitor vendor access to perform these software updates, and as well have the vendor most likely perform testing of the update in a test environment prior to it being put into your production environment or being moved into your production environment. Performing testing prior to installing the update in the production environment will confirm the accuracy of processing, as well as eliminate any potential errors in the processing of your organization's data. So by implementing these best practices, organizations can effectively manage their software vendors at any point in time during their terms of their contract. Are there any questions?
There were not any questions that came in. So I think we're all set. Thank you very much, Bob.